Hello, and welcome to Acts of Subversive Kindness, Part 5 for me. I wonder how you got on with the charms. Ian Duig posted something marvellous this weekend about May charms, which I shared on Facebook on May Day. And I note in the FWS letter for April, there's a poetry competition on that very subject. How strange. In the right way. Maybe some of the work generated here will find a happy home there. All the best if you do send out your charming poems. I'm touching wood for you now. Now, perhaps you'd expect me to think about the May subject in October, but I'm going to do it as we leave Beltane. Fear. We all experience fear, especially in the early stages of the pandemic. Many of us felt it facing the unknown. After all, none of us had lived through a plague before. For some, there would be a time of shocked creative response, or for others, there was a certain closing down of what we could do and make. For some, there was a deft response and roads made for themselves and also made for others to express their situation in the grip of this new terror. Hugh Macmillan's Poems of Pestilence is a superb archive of how we lived through the early days of COVID. A huge work, and I think it's so fitting that Hugh, as a historian, was behind this extraordinary series. Equally important and complementary, we had the Postcards from Malthusia sequence, where poets responded to a call from Bill Herbert and former Makar Andy Jackson, looking not only at COVID, but at some of the great dangers of our times. This emerged from their New Boots and Pantisocracies quest, and that dynamic continues in their travel through the good and godly ballads. And we're going to be hearing a lot more about that. Good. So there is fear, which can both freeze and summon up creative energies. We look back at the time of the Black Death and see the considerable vigour across the arts, fear and the Renaissance. Even now, there is considerable creativity in response to the terrible news coming in from Ukraine. As you know, National Makar Kathleen Jamie has released a collected poem which is published by the Scottish Poetry Library. The legacy of poetry, in particular from the trenches of World War I, is extraordinary. I think too of how Goya responded to terror in his time, and that power is later seen in his compatriots' work. No one could silence what Guernica gave the world. Picasso did it massively then, and it's massive now. Andy Jackson's book, The Saints Are Coming, should be on your bookshelf now. I could read so many of the poems from this particular collection, and so many of calls out to saints obviously have emerged from deep fears. One of the obvious choice in a way here would be to read the chant of St. Edmund the Martyr, the patron saint against pandemics, which Andy wrote well ahead of COVID. And it's almost spooky. I really would urge you to read that. But I'm going to pick up on another poem, because you will be able to find Andy reading that wonderful poem against to the patron saint of pandemics. So I'm going to read another one which fits in with something else that is coming later in this. The Ordeal of St. Gratus of Aosta, patron saint against the fear of insects. First came fascination, for I did not know the fright of them. Framed by the proscenium of dusk, I saw a flight of them. Then I learned nomenclature, family, genus, species, estimations of their number, the incalculable blight of them. An order so abundant, yet so secretive, must be malign. I came to fear their shadow. How much more the sight of them? I observed them writhing in the updraft from the evening fire. Oh, the skittering horror of that batless night of them. Perhaps they saw me as the herald of a rival scourge. No less an infestation, although I was not quite of them. I tried in vain to splice the polar genes of love and terror, but to trust is to surrender, even to the bite of them. We fashion our own devils. Mine are black and shining, and yet I pray for tolerance and grace in spite of them. What I learned. The creeping things in life are tiny beasts. Do not let them swarm. See, they diminish as I write of them. Thank you, Andy, but there's really not a bad poem in that. Every poem is great in that. You really need to read it. So there are the huge collective fears, the wars, the plagues, the environmental catastrophe, and these can be both calls to action and they can be overwhelming. They generate and will continue to generate an essential body of work. I think so many poets from Northern Ireland write so brilliantly of what it is to fear, understandably. How well Colette Bryce addresses dread in her extraordinary collection, The M Papers. What of our own more individual fears? A bit like that one of insects that Andy has touched upon. I mentioned last month my own fear of flying. We all have them. Phobias, nagging fears. It's a big umbrella. Concerns about health and the well-being of those we love. In my case, I live with continual fears around my son's epilepsy, for example. When you witness a full-blown tonic-clonic seizure, you can understand how earlier people feared and tried to understand that condition through channels like possession. Out of our real control, fears. And another of my fears, and thankfully one I can tidy out of my mind quite often, is a fear of rats. I know loads of you will have a terror of rats, spiders, snakes, and more. Much as I'm not wild about encountering them, and especially not at eye height at dusk in a bramble bush mid-forage by Campbelltown Loch, here's a big shout out. Rats have been good to me on the poetry front. I don't know how many poems they've scurried into, but clearly they have all sorts of presence for me. Rats make themselves into metaphors, unbidden. Thank you, rats. So here's a wee poem of my own about rats, which was written in Corsica, in all the wrong places. Afraid, I anticipated him, reckoned killer boxes in the owner's shed. I sensed that Machia, dense with his lives, head rattled, all the words he'd claimed, scratch, scuttle, rustle, scurry, no. He glutted my dark. Nightly I fretted him, sifted seeds for scat. On the lane's camber I tensed, stared riddles at stink-wide bins for humped moves. No shadows shot from flag-leaf drains. I detected no presence in dikes. No quick through briar thicks, none. I opened myself to planets and stars. There. Rat. Sleek along telegraph wires. Cork oak to cork oak, smooth on summer low cables. Linear acrobat. And yeah, there's a huge presence of arboreal rats in Corsica, which is probably more information than you really need. But I also have a poetry-specific fear. I've never addressed it, and I don't think I have shared it. It will keep a bit longer. I think it will surprise you, but I will only tell you at the end of this video. At Stanza this year, my standout event, the reading I loved most among so many standout readings, was, as usual, not the one I had actually expected. Fiona Benson, I cannot praise her most recent collection, Ephemeron. There it is. Highly enough. There's a section devoted to a study of insects. All very well, she said. Insects were fine, but the poet came to face her own fear. She has a real phobia about cockroaches. It gave her a lot of problems. And having lived in Cyprus with a resident roach, which scuttled out periodically in the shower, she really knew that territory. And she found it very difficult to write about that. But she confronted that fear. And the result is a truly extraordinary poem. So I'm going to read just a little bit of it just now. Mama Cockroach, I love you, Lato Deo, because you cozy with the aunties in your reeking slums, and are intimate and sweet, because you begrudge no one a meal, but ooze a fecal trail to lead your commune to its source, like a dirty bee, because you're joyfully promiscuous, because you pouch your young and hide them in the sweaty creases of the house near suppurating food, so they'll hatch to a feast. Or keep your eggs with you in a special purse shaped like a kidney bean and clutch it fast, or reinsert them in your abdomen and womb them there, or carry them as yolks and give live birth, then feed your pale brood secretions from your anus or your armpit glands like milk, or deep in the flesh of a rotten log, pass them a bolus of pre-digested food, mouth to mouth. And it's a wonderful poem, and I really recommend that collection to you. And I'm going to give Fiona Benson a double billing here. She really is that good. She deserves it. She also read a poem which makes her deeply fearful every time she reads it. It's autobiographical, and she says her mum practically disowned her when she read it. It's stunning, and it's in that same collection. And the reason she, a straight woman, makes herself read it publicly is to make a huge statement about the terrors which are not ones of the imagination, the very real terrors that LGBTIQ people face worldwide on a daily basis. And she does that to address how they really suffer from very real terrors. And if you can hear her read it, I really recommend it. However, before I leave you, I'll admit to my own poetry fear. And old teacher that I am, I know I could not ask something of you. I cannot ask you to write about fears if I don't do the same myself. By the nature of having a son with a learning disability, I have stayed in the realms of children's poetry on a nightly basis, perhaps longer than is usual. And what amazing work there is. And it's a big part of my son's bedtime routine. I'm hugely grateful to all the amazing poets who have given us so much that he and I can both enjoy these nightly readings. And I have absolutely no idea how you write a poem for a child. Shocking, isn't it? But I have just been loaned a copy of a book by another hero of mine. Here it is. It's Paula Rego's Nursery Rhymes, in which she responds with etchings, which are just so scarily beautiful, to these wonderful, sometimes quite sinister nursery rhymes that have just been part of everybody's lexicon forever. And these etchings, for me, recall very much the series of Goya's Sleep of Reason masterpieces. Rego is truly a sorcerer of fears. But it's high time I addressed my own fears and got down to trying to write a poem for children. I wish you all well, and I will see you sometime in June.